In this video, we are going to be talking about different brain areas and neurotransmitters that are associated with promoting wakefulness. And then towards the very end, we'll actually talk about the neurotransmitters that promote sleep. For this video, you're going to be required to make a table. So take out a piece of paper, or you can print out the table from Canvas. And it needs to have 3 columns, one for brain region, one for neurotransmitter, and one for function. And then you'll need to have 7 rows at the minimum. So here's 1, 2, and 3. So you'll need 4 more rows. So we're going to start off this video talking about what keeps us awake during the day. And you'll see there's a lot of overlapping mechanisms that allow us to stay awake for an extended period of time. And again, this is the complete table. So again, 3 columns, 7 rows, and we'll fill this in along as we go. And then at the end, you're going to either scan it in somewhere or snap a picture and upload it. And that will just be verification that you've completed this video and earn you some points for the day. So the question is, again, what helps us to stay awake for an extended period of time during the day? Like I mentioned, we have a lot of different brain mechanisms that are associated with wakefulness and arousal. And we'll talk about each of these different brain regions in some detail with a slide dedicated to, I think, each one of them. And so that's where we're going to, this brain region will go in that first column, and then we'll talk about the neurotransmitters and the functions in the second and third column of that table. The first area we're going to talk about is the reticular formation. And you see here, remember back from chapter 3, the anatomy chapter, that it is part of that hindbrain, and it's got an ascending portion that extends from the medulla up into the forebrain, and it's a bundle of white matter. And do you remember what that white matter means? It's a bundle of axons and also some neurons, but it extends basically from the medulla up into the midbrain, and then it has these widespread projections to the cortex. So sending projections to the forebrain. And the neurotransmitter that's important in this pathway is acetylcholine. That's going to be used to arouse the cortex and promote consciousness. So again, we have this formation called the reticular formation that is going to send projections to that forebrain, the bundle of white matter and neurons, and it's going to arouse the cortex and promote consciousness. So for our first input into this table, the brain region is the reticular formation. Now, do you remember what neurotransmitter and what the function was? Yes, acetylcholine. And the function is that it arouses the cortex and promotes consciousness. So again, remember, it comes up through that hindbrain. It's a bundle of axons. The ascending portion is going to project to that forebrain and arouse the cortex. The next area we're going to talk about is the pontomesencephalon. And so if you look here, this little area here is that pontomesencephalon. It's part of the midbrain, and it's going to also contribute to cortical arousal, which means we probably have some excitatory neurotransmitters involved. So glutamate, remember, was that major excitatory neurotransmitter that we discussed, and then we have acetylcholine. And so this pontomesencephalon is going to have projections to the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the basal forebrain, and then those areas have these widespread projections to the cortex. So stimulation of this pontomesencephalon will awake somebody who's sleeping, and if you stimulate it in someone who's already awake, it's going to increase that alertness because it's involvement in cortical arousal. All right, so the next thing to put into our table is the pontomesencephalon. And so what neurotransmitters did we say were involved? Acetylcholine also, like we saw in the reticular formation, and then glutamate. And the function is to arouse the cortex. So again, it has those projections to the hypothalamus, thalamus, and basal forebrain, and from there, those projections then arouse the cortex. The next area we're going to talk about is the locus coeruleus, which is in the pons. So if we go here, again, here's the medulla, here's the pons, here's that locus coeruleus. And Here it's just showing you for this locus coeruleus all these different projections as well, going to those cortical areas. And it releases NE, which is norepinephrine, to arouse the cortex and again increase wakefulness. So again, we're seeing a lot of these overlapping functions of brain regions to promote that wakefulness, but we do stay awake for an extended period of time during the day. It also has bursts of activity to meaningful events. And so that's another function of this locus coeruleus in the pons. And while we're asleep, it is very inactive. All right, so the next thing to put into our table is the locus coeruleus. And do we remember what neurotransmitter we said? Norepinephrine, involved in arousing the cortex, increasing wakefulness, has bursts of activity to meaningful events. The next area we're going to talk about is the hypothalamus. Okay, so here is thalamus, and the hypothalamus sits just below it. The hypothalamus is going to release histamine to produce widespread excitatory effects throughout the brain. But wait, if it releases histamine, then why do those allergy medicines like Benadryl, why do they make me sleepy? That's right, they are actually antihistamines. And so there are new ones out there that don't cause drowsiness, and they're second generation antihistamines. They either don't cross the blood-brain barrier, and so they're working more just on your nasal passages, and or they are working on specific histamine receptors that aren't involved in the role of histamine promoting alertness. So yes, so the hypothalamus releases histamine, which causes alertness. It also has another neurotransmitter, orexin, which has another name as well, hypocretin. We're going to refer to it as orexin, though. It is also responsible for allowing us to stay awake. Now, there is a sleep aid out there called Belsomra, which is a drug that blocks orexin receptors and helps people to go to sleep. And it has less side effects than some of your traditional sleep aids. And we'll talk about those momentarily or in another video. And it's one of the newer drugs out there on the market. Also, as we'll talk about later, people who have narcolepsy have low levels of orexin. And research suggests that this loss of orexin-containing cells could potentially be part of an autoimmune disorder. So now we need to fill in the table again. We have the hypothalamus, and do we remember those two neurotransmitters? We had histamine that promotes alertness. We had orexin that promotes staying awake. And I'm not going to hold you responsible for knowing the specific areas that these are released from, just knowing in general that it's the hypothalamus. The next area we're going to talk about is the basal forebrain. So the basal forebrain is right here where you see it says BF. And those cells are going to be stimulated by the orexin from the hypothalamus. When they're stimulated, they're going to release acetylcholine, which is then going to sharpen our attention. So this is again excitatory, so it's increasing our arousal. So let's fill in that table one more time. We saw here that it's a basal forebrain, and do we remember what neurotransmitter we said was involved? Acetylcholine to sharpen attention. And again, it's these orexin-producing cells from the hypothalamus that project to the basal forebrain and then stimulate the basal forebrain to release acetylcholine. So, after looking at that diagram, what neurotransmitter do you think is responsible for allowing us to stay asleep? GABA. So GABA decreases our temperature, decreases metabolic rate, decreases the stimulation of neurons. So it kind of comes along and just all those mechanisms that keep us awake during the day, it inhibits those. And so this diagram is showing you, here's the arousal promoting mechanisms, and then here's GABA inhibiting all of those, promoting inhibiting all those mechanisms, promoting sleep. So another mechanism of sleep that I want to mention is the homeostatic influence of sleep. I don't believe it's in your textbook unless it got added in this latest edition. But a lot of times students will ask, well, how does caffeine work? And so in order to understand that, you have to understand this homeostatic mechanism of sleep, which involves adenosine So what happens is, and we mean homeostatic, is that it's something that kind of balances out over time. And so with adenosine, we have this buildup during the day as our sleep debt increases. So adenosine continues to increase. So here's showing you our wake phase. And so this is adenosine waking up. Then we have, you see showing our melatonin. This is our melatonin phase, going along with our circadian rhythm. And then when we sleep, that adenosine drops and it gets to a certain level, and then we wake up. And that buildup of adenosine promotes sleep, and then it drops again. So adenosine builds up during the day as our sleep debt increases. And then the way that caffeine can actually work is that, okay, let's say we're up here, we feel this sleep pressure, but we want to stay awake later. So we take some sort of, we take a drink that has caffeine in it. And that caffeine binds then to those adenosine receptors and doesn't allow adenosine to bind and promote sleep, thus keeping us awake. Now we're just going to fill in this table again. We had GABA and adenosine. So both promote sleep. And then GABA is also inhibiting those arousal pathways. And that's how it promotes sleep. Adenosine it builds up during the day, and then as it binds those receptors, it also induces sleep. So please make sure that you have filled this table in completely. And there'll be a place on Canvas for you to upload it either. And for this one, I will take a JPEG of it, or you can scan it in as a PDF if you have that capability as well.